I'm wondering a little more about these master officers.
Yeah.
It seems to me that you were talking about their activity on the ground floor as not being awfully formal, having a lot of time to accomplish relationships, less governance, more like a family role, at least. And I wonder, tell us more about the kind of people that you tried to screen for to do this kind of work, and what you know about them. So supposing other people were interested in developing these kinds of officers, who are we looking for?
I'd have to go back and look at the criteria to become a master police officer to kind of get real specific about this. But there were certain things that they had to be able to do. They had to show all the kinds of things that we just talked about. They had to demonstrate that they were committed to the larger profession. They had to demonstrate that they were team players. They had to demonstrate that they could solve complex problems. And so there are a few areas like that became the criteria. And in order for them to become one, they had to demonstrate to people within the community that they were worthy, not just police. They had police on their selection panel, but also people in the community who could say yes or no. I don't want that person as a master police officer. I do want that person. And so it was along those lines that we proceeded and moved forward. But ultimately, what we learned over time, John, was that people who thrived in relationships, people who had a tremendous service orientation. I mean, I can get into the basics of these folks were less concerned about their own promotion and their own egos and things like that. They were more concerned about others, and they didn't necessarily seek limelight. They were really kind of behind the scenes people that they were comfortable with. They didn't want to be more in the organization other than be a police officer. Mm-hmm. And so, in essence, they were just selfless, caring, relationship-oriented people with lots of skill sets along those lines that we talked about.
And you had community members in a process of selecting who would be in their neighborhood the master officer.
Right. Yeah. And well, they wouldn't select who was in the neighborhood. They would select who is the master police officer.
No, that's what I meant. Yeah.
Yeah. But when it came to neighborhoods, the vast majority of police departments shift their officers a lot around the community. Mm-hmm. We decided to keep our officers in our neighborhoods for at least a full year, but that may not seem like a long time. But oftentimes we had citizens saying we don't want to lose our officer, mm-hmm. and we want them to continue to be our police officer in our neighborhood. Mm-hmm. So I'm getting into a lot of nuts and bolts about the development of our police department over time in terms of the kind of people, how we recruited, how we hired, who we hired, how we trained, how we led the architecture of the organization. All those things had to shift in order to support this kind of relationship-oriented way of doing police work. Now, one of the things you may encounter if other police look at this, I don't know if they will, but what do you do when the feces hits the fan and you need police officers that are not unlike what they just did in Boulder, Colorado, which, by the way, is 10 miles from here. Yeah. And I knew a lot of those folks there as well. And now all of a sudden they have this mass shooter. And the police, how do you find people that can do what you're talking about, Butler, and then do that and find that in the same person, so to speak? That's not an easy task, but it can be done. And you had to hire. I mean, you had to be thinking about versatility when you hired people, and people who could do the work of a master police officer in a neighborhood, mentor a 15-year-old kind of wayward boy. We did a lot of mentoring, by the way. There's a tremendous amount of mentoring that happened as well. And then all of a sudden respond to a set of circumstances where everybody's guns are drawn, and there's potential for other people in the community to get hurt if you don't do something.
Is there anything that is in somebody's background when you're hiring, a police officer that suggests, oh, maybe that person is going to have both these skill sets?
It's more than both.
Yeah, multiple.
Part of it is, it's what we ask. One of the things that I think may have to shift is what we're asking police departments and police officers to do is too much.
Yeah.
And part of the shift that communities, if they make them and realize that there's different ways of dealing with the issues that they're dealing with and just sending cops at them, will kind of help police departments not be so overwhelmed by, we're the only ones that are responding on a 24/7 basis to what's happening with these social and health issues. The hiring, I could probably get back to you on. I'd have to go back and ask somebody for all the hiring criteria that we looked at. But relationship oriented was big. Could they, you can actually, it's easier to train people how to respond to those kinds of circumstances that occurred in Boulder than it is to find people who can do the kind of work as a master police officer that we're talking about. And so sometimes you have to depend on the training to help out with, okay, they may not have these skill sets in terms of how to do this, but do they have the wherewithal, the poise, the sense of who they are in terms of their own physical capacities? That's a big part of it. You can't deny that. And oftentimes, I mean, I would say the average age of the police officer we hired, this had a lot to do with it, was somewhere around 31 or 32 years of age.
Interesting.
And I stayed away from hiring. You could be a cop once you're 21.
Yeah.
I would hardly ever hire somebody in early. I mean, if we ever hired anybody in the early 20s. And so we hired people who had great life experience, had other jobs. They're no longer the center of their own universe. They've experienced pain, their own sense of frustration, failure, rejection, disappointment. And they were just quality, mature people.
Yeah.
And so they all educated, almost all of them had college. We hired social workers, youth service workers. We've hired pastors. We've hired school teachers. We kind of leaned into those arenas because there was this sense, well, they got into those arenas for a reason. Yeah. And the guy that I don't know if you heard, but the guy Talley that was killed in Boulder, I don't know if you remember that, but the officer that was killed had a career in something else prior to becoming a cop in Boulder. That's not unusual as much as I wanted to be a cop all my life is not the kind of people we're necessarily hiring.
Yeah.
So it's a balancing act of finding certain characteristics in people that we know can do this complex work, and at the same time are trainable to do things that might be on the extreme ends of things that they may have to do. Yeah. So I'll leave it at that.
What percentage of the force that you had was made up of these master officers?
Well, actually, it became something. I was able to convince our city management that I didn't want it to be a competitive process. You competed against the criteria, not against each other. And so, out of about 170, 80 officers, we had like 50 of them that were master police officers. And the pay was significantly greater, by the way. Really? It was significantly greater. And so we were able to set that up. So, and I will say this, I was able to convince our elected officials and our city management folks that without these master police officers, I'd probably need another 30 or 40 police officers because they did so much. And when you start multiplying 100,000+ a year, 110,000 a year times 30 or 40 versus 50 paying 57 to 8,000 more a year, the difference was significant. And so, and we got a lot more out of it in terms of the impact of quality in terms of the community. Now, let me just say, we went from 5,000 Part 1 crimes when we had 65,000 people in this community to less than 3,000 Part 1 crimes with 100,000 people in this community. And the other things that we did along the way was, you're familiar with restorative justice, I take it.
Sure. Yes.
Our police officers are, they're no question, they're the most highly skilled police officers when it comes to restorative practices and principles. We referred over the years 7,000 to 8,000 people versus arresting them. And we did a lot of other things along the lines of, we're not going to arrest people for possession of narcotics. We're not going to arrest people because they're struggling with their mental health and committed a crime. We actually were forerunners in the state of Colorado, in some ways, this country, around developing ways of dealing with folks. And we got the community, the social capital got on board with that.
Where is restorative justice based in Longmont? Is it in?
Well, this gets into the whole community-based thinking.
Yeah.
When we put it together, we didn't want it under government.
Right.
We wanted it to be a community-based program, and it is. And volunteers, there's a few paid, 3 or 4 paid people, but hundreds of volunteers from the community.
So the police was active at the origin of the RJ program?
I was.
Sure.
And another lady named Beverly Title, were the ones that kind of put it together.
Right.
And so, and frankly, we had, I don't know how deep you want to go, but we had a long-range strategic plan that included 1,000 people, about 800 of them from the community, that took us 18 months to put together. I mean, it took us a long time because we had to get through all the conversations. You have a newspaper editor and a police officer from the Midnight Watch in the same room trying to figure out how to create a strategy for the future. Those are conversations that never occurred. And so we wanted to make sure that those kind of conversations had time to occur. But one of the strategies that came out of that was to create alternatives to our criminal justice system. And so for years, we went down this path of creating alternatives to the criminal justice system, in which restorative justice, the Angel Initiative, the mental health programs, the addiction programs, the rewind programs. We wanted to get to a point where we didn't have to arrest any kids or summons any kids in our community, that we would send them through these programs unless it was an ultra serious crime. And so that was part of shifting an internal culture within. But in terms of getting to the point of our conversation this morning, our police officers were charged with going into these neighborhoods and shifting the responsibility from us to the neighborhood. And that's what the metric was. The effectiveness was very much found in, you're no longer needed. Imagine if all government entities came up with the effectiveness model of, we want to put ourselves out of business. And to the level that we can we can assist someone with their self-sufficiency and to sustain that self-sufficiency in small and large ways so that we can just back out and they can take over was a big part of what we did. I mean, it just became part of our culture, part of our philosophy, part of how we did business in the community. And they got to realize that. And that worked in our Latino neighborhoods too, by the way. Not just it worked a lot in our Latino neighborhoods because most of these neighborhoods were Latino, lots of Latino population in the neighborhoods that we're talking about, especially at Stonehenge. I say 80%, maybe 85% Latino. So I didn't know, I don't know how that sounded, but I didn't want to make it seem like it was easy neighborhoods. These were difficult neighborhoods with lots of complexities regarding disorder and crime, and lots of isolation and disconnectedness, and people feeling fearful and not wanting to be involved and not trusting at some point police. All those things had to be worked through. And so we did a tremendous amount of that. And I left last July. And what I can't take any credit for or responsibility for is what's happened since then. And I kind of removed myself from all of that. I don't need to go into that, but it was, I disassociated so much because I wanted the people that were there to kind of think, they were ready to go and to kind of continue this.
Yes.
And I didn't want to be there to say, okay, here's how. I didn't want them to call me a lot and say, how do you do this and how do you do that? I wanted them to figure this out. And so I kind of went incommunicado with a lot of what I did in the last 8-9 months. So anyway, that's how it went. And what happens is, as I think I explained this, was once these neighborhoods began to find their own power and they began to find their own sense of their own voice, and that meant something. It's amazing what happens with the police are no longer the power broker, like they are in so many different neighborhoods around in our country, and they set themselves up as the power broker in a way. And so when communities and neighborhoods find their own power, that's going to be the essence of how police cultures will eventually shift, is that people aren't calling them for everything. And they're not, the mantra of, if you need us, call us for anything, will disappear. And now what will police departments do? What will be their role? I think becomes another interesting conversation around what's that look like. But we have to get through a lot of this initial, how do communities find their power? How do neighborhoods find their power? And so what will happen with police when that happens?
Can I ask just a follow up there? You're talking about difficult neighborhoods that might not have had very pleasant encounters with the police in the past. So I'm wondering, so you've got the master police officers who have more people skills, let's call it, but there's an awful lot of repair work that has to get done, isn't there? You talked about a shooting in 1980, probably holdovers of distrust. Was there some difficult points, some tough meetings that had to get worked through?
All the time, those still go on. And, oftentimes what we were kind of, I'm not going to say the police were victims of it in the long run, but oftentimes what people begin to think is what happened in Los Angeles and Chicago or Minneapolis happens in the long run. I mean, it's like you got this 24/7 news cycle that's constantly bombarding people with, here's what you need to be afraid of, and here's you have a reason to be fearful of the police. And so that's a constant constant for all of us. It's not as great.
I guess just to put a finer point on it, okay? So imagine a sort of somebody who's been around the neighborhood for a while. Okay, you're coming to me, you want to have a meeting, but a guy in your force a couple of years back wasn't so nice, so how do I trust that this is a real change on your department rather than some kind of public relations effort?
Well, let me just say, we didn't encounter that anywhere near as much as we did initially. There's no question about that.
After the shooting?
No, well.
Sorry,
yeah,
I didn't hear you.
It was the shooting, and then I came in '93, and then there was still a lot of that, that kind of residual energy. But then over the years, Al, that began to dissipate as they began to see more consistent response. And in fact, we did surveys every other year in the community. And they're very comprehensive surveys about not only what did you think about the police interaction. Some of it was transactional in terms of, if you've had contact with the police, we want to know about that. Another part of that was, what can you do to help your community or your neighborhood? Another part of that is, what are the issues you're seeing in the community? I mean, it was a fairly extensive, and we'd pass out like 3,000, 4,000 surveys and get like 1,500 back.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, and so return. And so over the years, you could see the surveys numbers kind of go up and up and up and up and up around what people began to think about. And so the reputation of the police changed radically. Not to say that every detractor disappeared. I mean, let's face it. I mean, we do a business, we're the only business in town that still takes people's freedom away. And you arrested my brother,
right?
And I don't like that. Or you arrested my son, whatever. I mean, what are you going to do? So that kind of detractor kind of thing is kind of always, it's not right underneath the surface, but I'll tell you, one or two bad deals and that stuff can just get blown away. And I mean, the confidence and the trust can disappear quickly. And so, unfortunately, in the time I was there, that never happened.
Okay.
And by the way, we had a number of, I shouldn't say that. We had, in one 9-month period, we had 3 officer-involved shootings. And I mean, just tell you what the community did. No one blinked. There was very little media response to it. And it's not like we had control of the media. I mean, the Denver media came in, the local media was there. I mean, in terms of initially, but the response from the community was, how are you doing? And these were, you can have, I don't know how this sounds to you guys, but you can have officer involved shootings that are totally legitimate and justified in a community, and the community will still erupt because there's no trust. Or you can have these legitimate, justified shootings and the community will support you. That's where the Longmont community has been for years. And so, and not that that's a litmus test, but that happened twice to us. And I don't know what that means to your heads when I say that, but every now and then we encounter people that want to shoot us or shoot somebody else.
Yeah.
And that happens.
I'm trying to think about the major activities that you engaged in that led to the culture shift. And you've told us about the significance of the walks, the significance of the special officers, the master officers, and the significance of your stimulating new alternative organizations, right, that could deal with what you shouldn't be dealing with. three things that at least I hear you're engaged in. I wonder though if you could tell us your order. What are the 3 or 4 most significant activities that you think your force and you engaged in that made the difference?
Well, this may not seem as maybe as obvious as it, but we invited the community in. We opened up our doors. We became less like a fortress. We opened up our entire organization to people in the community. There are people in the community walking around our building. You go into most police facilities and, you know, it's secured plexiglass and brick walls the moment you walk through the front door. Our buildings are even designed to kind of invite people in.
Can you break that down a little bit? Because I think that's really important. I mean, so how do you move from a fortress to this more open space?
So everything we did had community involvement, strategic planning, police officer hiring. We even had high school kids sit on interview boards. That was huge, right? to get it beyond. You're going to let some pimply faced, high hormone raging kid select who I'm going to work with. Yep. and hire or promotions. The selection to master police officers, kind of coming up with all but everything we did, policy development. They were even invited to our staff meetings, and a number of people, and you have community members in the room. It's amazing how the conversations are different than if you don't. And so they would show up with ideas. One early on, some citizens came in and said, "We think you need a citizen volunteer patrol. We want to be able to patrol our own neighborhoods as well." And I didn't mention that earlier, probably could have, but so they came up with the idea, and we sent a group of citizens and a group of officers to Delray Beach, Florida, of all places, and learned what they were doing with some of their activities there. And the volunteer opportunities, we enlarged those dramatically in terms of what, they work out of our undercover units. They worked on investigations. They worked in our patrol division. They worked in administration. They were part of everything. And so when we say we invited the community in, I mean, we made them a part of everything that we did. And they weren't, I knew very few of these people. I'd lived in this community for a while, but I knew very few of them.
So they weren't the usual suspects, in other words.
Exactly. Yep. And oftentimes officers, hey, we need this person to help out. And we even had citizens working with highly confidential intelligence information because they had the skill sets to be able to kind of do a lot of cross tabulation around and analyzing. And so initially it was not well received. It was not well because they were a faceless entity within the community. We lived behind this fortress. And so that was huge. I can't understate. And and then when you had things happen in the community, you had community members standing up and saying, "Well, I know all these guys." I mean, we had thousands over the years that worked within our police. I mean, they infiltrated and
was there a point person in the department who helped?
Yeah, we developed a position, Al, that did that.
Yeah.
We had to develop what we called a volunteer coordinator, but
right.
And their whole unit.
Was that part-time, full-time?
Oh, it's full-time. I mean, but then we also had a lot of subsidiaries to that where people could say, "Hey, I need some help. Can I bring in some community members to help out with this?" And all the volunteer unit did was find people and bring them in, do background checks, make sure that they were okay, and away they went. But, over time, it was, it went from tremendous resistance to it was their idea to bring all these people in. And so that was huge. And that got people our officers feeling comfortable with people in the community. Wow. And realizing that the community, our motto was policing in partnership with the community. And so that was what we did. And so that was big. The other thing that was huge for me anyway was I spent a lot of time in personal conversations, either with groups of officers or with individual officers. The other thing we did was we basically got rid of the command and control way of doing business. I always thought that I wanted our officers to respond to our community the way I responded to them. And if they thought they were partners with management and me, if their voice counted, if their thoughts mattered, and they were invited to every single meeting and they were part of everything that they wanted to be a part of, that they would replicate that model in the community, and that worked.
Getting rid of command and control is amazing, but it's also, there's some consequences, because with a command and control system, an officer has somebody else to blame to point to. But when you get rid of it, you're on your own in terms of accountability.
Well, let me just say this, that we had tremendous amounts of conversations around a kind of, developing cultures of accountability and what that looked like. And we had officers teaching here's what personal accountability looks like. The peer accountability was through the roof in terms of people saying, hey, whenever you do something, that reflects on me, not good. And so we kind of identified the kind of sources of accountability. It came from the individual first, the peer second, a distant supervisor, and the fourth was the chief's office, the internal affairs piece. Now, the vast majority of police departments are concerned about the internal affairs, and they're not concerned about their peers or anything. And so that's a shift. And by the way, you got to hire people that want to be able to choose accountability. And that's another criteria. As we get into this discussion, that's another criteria that we look for in terms of people who did that, because you're right, Al. Once you remove that it's someone else's problem, not mine, it's amazing to what level of accountability people take. But initially, when I talked about it, oh, that sounds great. But as it played out initially, officers were very fearful of that.
Yeah.
And because now they realize that, I'm not going to sit around and, if they make their own, here's the thing I promised them was, if you make a mistake and it's good faith and you think you're doing the right thing, there will be no discipline unless you do it over and over and over again. And that was rare. If you make a mistake, you know where I'm going with this, and there was intention on your part, all bets are off. And so people got comfortable with, it's okay to make a mistake. I'm not going to get hung out to dry.
Yeah.
And so and that took time for that kind of, there was some, is that really going to happen? But that's what happened. We went from like 150 internal affairs investigations a year before I got there to less than 6. It was 5 or 6 a year.
Wow.
And because we shifted where the accountability was, and it came out of the chief's office. Now it's yours. And so there's a lot of things that go into that. We flattened the organization big time. We got rid of 2 levels of within the organization. And so, but the whole idea here was that if this is the way they were being treated, that they would go out into the community and treat community members that way as well. That was just another aspect of culture within that impacted the culture between. that was very, very important for us. And so I will tell you one little side story here. The guy who hired me, about a month into, after he hired me, he had all the directors around the city talk about leadership. And I talked about this kind of leadership. And I thought he knew because he hired me. This is what I talked about.
Yeah.
And I talked about cultures of accountability. I talked about, ownership. I talked about, that, your voice counts as long as your agenda is bigger than your self-interest, kinds of things. And you're invited every single meeting, and the community is invited, and all this. And when he heard that, his idea of a police department is that it's a top-down kind of way of doing business. He stood up out of his chair, and the veins in his neck were as big as I've ever seen them, and that'll take you 50 years to figure that out. And I thought he was going to fire me. I really thought, because he did this in front of my peers. And I did make a long story short here. In about 3 years, he began to see. And he called me one day into his office, and he says, I have to apologize for this because I've seen what's happened. So anyway, that's a side story. But to get to your...
So they knew all about you, but they hired you anyway, in other words.
Well, I wonder how much you knew about me. And so John, it's community engagement, lots of conversations on my part, a modeling that took place in terms of what was going on, the spreading out of decisions, the expectation that when you walk through the front door, you needed to engage your brain, and you needed to take ownership for this organization, not just, what's going to happen to you that particular day. And there were so many other things that just kind of played out over time. But police officers, maybe more so than maybe the average population, they're very much show me and prove it to me. And so we had to get there, and we eventually did.